In this video, I play 2-5 cash at the Wynn in Las Vegas, Nevada. The $10 straddle is on all night and I get into many huge pots for thousands, even capping the session off with a $2,000 6-bet bluff. In the first hand of the session, I have 10-9 of spades and raise to $15 in the low jack. The hijack and the small blind both make the call and the flop comes king 9-5. The small blind checks, and with just middle pair here, I'm going to check, and the hijack bets $35. Small blind folds, and I'm not going anywhere quite yet. I make the call. The turn comes the 5 of hearts. I check, and this time my opponent bets 110 into about 115. This should just be a fold most of the time, but against this particular opponent, I thought he could definitely be bluffing, so I go ahead and call. The river comes the 4 of spades. I check and my opponent bets 250 this time into about 340. This should really just be a fold. I just have a bluff catcher and really not a great one. I would much rather have a king, but I don't feel like folding. I make the call and we hear this.
I have a king.
My opponent shows king 10 of clubs and goes for all 3 streets of value. I would just typically fold this hand on turns versus most opponents, but this guy is not most opponents. We will see more of him in this next hand where I pick up pocket 9s. There is an under the gun limp for $5. The cutoff raises to $15 and the button 3-bets to $65. We are in the big blind and I have a decision. The GTO and theory play would be to just fold here, but this game is not too tough, so I decide to just make the cold call. People weren't really 3-betting and 4-betting much in this game at all, so I thought I could get away with just set mining here. We do get away with this as the under the gun player and the cutoff make the call. The flop comes king 7-6. We do not flop a set. I check and action ends up checking around. The turn, however, is a 9. With $260 in the pot and a flush draw on the flop, I am going to bet here. I bet $100 and just the under the gun player who limped pre-flop ends up making the call. The river comes the 6 of diamonds. We now have a boat. I could bet here, but I think there are some draws like clubs or 10-8 that miss and have to bluff. This is also the same opponent who value bet 3 streets with a weak king in the last hand, so I wouldn't put it past him if he bet a king here. I set the trap and check. And it doesn't take long for my opponent to bet $200 into about 460. With about $900 in my stack at this point, there's nothing to do but go all in. My opponent thinks about it for a little while, but eventually makes the call. We got him back in an over $2,000 pot. Obviously, I got a little loose pre-flop making the cold call, and that's something you won't see me doing very often, but luckily it did pay off in this over $2,000 pot. In the next hand, we have pocket jacks in the big blind, and there is an early position limp for $5. The cutoff raises to $25 and the button calls. Certainly going to put in the squeeze here. I make it 130. The cutoff and the button both make the call. The flop comes 9-4-3 rainbow. Not totally sure what to do when out of position in these multi-way pots. This board certainly favors my opponent's ranges who can have pairs like pocket 9s, pocket 4s, pocket 3s. So I tend to proceed with caution and I start off by checking. The cutoff checks back, but the button bets 130. A bet from this player is not too concerning considering they only started the hand with about $600. I am happy to get it all in with this player for this amount, so I check raise to $300. The cutoff, who's really the only guy we were concerned with, folds and the button makes a call. The turn is the king of diamonds. With about $1,000 in the pot and my opponent only having about $400 left behind, this is kind of an awkward spot. I could go all in here and maybe get called by a 9 or maybe something like pocket 10s, but otherwise I don't really see much reason for going all in here, so I check and my opponent checks back. The river comes the 5 of hearts. With basically the same logic that I just stated, I go ahead and check once again and my opponent checks back. I show and as expected, we are good. In the next hand, I have jack 10 of spades and raise to $15 on the button, the small blind and the big blind call. The flop comes queen 8-7, 2 spades. This is obviously a great flop for us. We have a gut shot with a flush draw. When action checks to me, I bet $30 into about 45. Just a small blind makes a call and the turn comes the 7 of spades. I now have a beautiful flush, and this time the small blind decides to lead. They fumble with their chips and intend to make it $50, but end up leading for $25. I could raise here, but if they don't have a 7, I think everything else just folds. Also, if they are bluffing, we want to keep them in the pot. We have this board pretty locked up, and we can just get it all in on the river. I make the call, and the river is the 7 of hearts. I guess I meant to say most rivers. This is a terrible card for us. Any pair is now a full house, so when my opponent bets again, this time for $50 into about 150, I can't do anything but just make the call. And they show pocket tens. Very strangely played hand from my opponent. Glad it did not cost me any more than it did. In the next hand, I have king jack of spades in the big blind. There is an under the gun limp for $5. Under the gun 1 raises to $20. The button and the small blind call. Seems like another great spot for a squeeze, so that's what I do. I make it 140. This time action folds around to the small blind, who's the only one who makes the call. The flop comes ace 8 7, 2 diamonds. The small blind checks, and this board favors my range immensely. I make it 125 into about 320. The small blind makes a call, and the turn is the ace of clubs. My opponent checks once again, and I think it's unlikely they have an ace in this spot. I think a middling pair seems more likely. For this reason, I bet a size that sets the river up for a big jam. I make it 160, and my opponent makes a call. The river comes the ace of hearts. This time my opponent checks, and I need to decide what to do. It's very hard for them to have an ace, but it's also quite hard for me to have an ace now. This hand is also against the same opponent where I doubled up with pocket nines. If they have any sort of pair here, which I'm sure they do, I don't really see them folding. Who knows, maybe king high can beat the flush draws as well. For this reason, I give up and check back. To my surprise, they turn over pocket sevens. They flopped a set and slow played it in hopes that I would blast off, but I didn't, and we will live to survive another day. In the next hand, I have ace deuce of diamonds in the small blind. There is an under the gun straddle on for $10. The low jack raises to $35 and the button calls. I should generally just be folding this hand in this spot, but I decide to make the call. The under the gun straddle makes a call as well, and the flop comes ace jack 3, 2 hearts. I start by checking my weak top pair, and action checks around. The turn comes the 6 of hearts. I check again, and this time action once again checks around to the button, who this time bets $45. For this sizing, we are not loving life, but we make the call. Everyone else folds, and the river comes the 6 of spades. I check, and this time the button bets 125 into about 230. I don't really expect them to have a very strong ace when they check the flop back. I beat some missed heart draws, and I chop with a lot of other ace X. So I make the call, and my opponent shows ace jack. They flopped top 2 pair and decided to check back on a flush draw board. Very interesting play. In the next hand, I have ace king off, and there is an under the gun straddle again for $10. This straddle is on for the rest of the night, so I will stop mentioning it. The under the gun 1 player raises to $40, and there are 3 calls. We are in the big blind and 3-bet to 250. The under the gun player in the straddle is very loose and cold calls my raise. This leads the original raiser, who is under the gun 1, to 4-bet jam all in for about $1,600. This is a huge jam, and certainly one I need to consider. In normal circumstances versus a normal rec, I think this would be a pretty easy fold. But these circumstances are not normal. The loose under the gun player cold calling my large 3-bet makes the 4-better's range less strong, as of course there's a good amount of dead money in the pot. This was also in general just a pretty loose game. I mean, the straddle is on every hand now, so although we don't like it at all, I think we have to call. I finally put 1 chip into the pot, and the under the gun player now goes into the tank. They really want to call, but end up folding. With about $3,500 now in the pot, it is just up to myself and the 4-better, and we hear this.
Probably good.
I'm probably good?
No.
No. Can't say this yet. We at least know we are not crushed, but we still aren't feeling good without a made hand yet. We do feel a lot better when the flop comes king jack 6. The turn is an ace, and the river is a jack. We turn our hand over and are in fact good. The under the gun player in the straddle will later say he had pocket nines, and actually the under the gun 1 4-better says he had pocket nines as well. Glad they had each other's outs, and we ended up winning the flip. In the next hand, I have ace king off again and raised to $35 in the hijack. The button and the big blind make the call. The flop comes ace 9 8. Action checks to me, and I put in a C-bet of $60. The button and the big blind call. The turn comes the 7 of spades. This time, when the big blind checks, I certainly want to check this card back. Jack 10 gets there, as well as 6-5 for straights. There's also the possibility of a lot of 2 pairs. I check, and the button checks back as well. The river comes the 5 of hearts. This river makes things even worse, giving any 6x a straight. But when the big blind bets $75 into 285, not sure if I can fold. I don't in this case and make the call, but so does the button. It is going to be hard for me to win this one, and the big blind shows 8-7 of clubs for 2 pair, and the button shows ace-5 of diamonds for better 2 pair. With 4 to a straight on the river, I probably can fold, but couldn't find it in this hand. In the next hand, I have ace-6 of clubs and raise to $30 in the hijack. Cut off, the button, and the under the gun straddle make the call. The flop comes Jack 10-6, 1 club. Action checks to me, and with bottom pair, I'm just going to check here, and action ends up checking through. Turn is the 4 of hearts. This time, action checks around to the button, and he bets $50. Action checks to me, and with a pair and a good kicker, I don't think I can fold quite yet. My opponent will still have some bluffs like straight draws or flush draws, and we can always improve on the river. The cutoff folds, and the river comes the 8 of clubs. I check, and this time my opponent bets $100 into about 220, so about half pot. Curiosity gets the best of me, and I make the call, and my opponent ends up showing 6-4 off. This is the same opponent we stacked with ace king. I guess he's trying to get back at us, and he got us back. A little bit. In the next hand, I have ace queen of diamonds in the big blind. The under the gun 1 player raises to $50. There's an early position call, the button calls, and the small blind calls. I could certainly 3-bet squeeze here, but it would have to be for a lot, and the under the gun 1 player raising to such a large sizing is quite unusual and a little bit concerning. For this reason, I decided to just call in the big blind. The flop comes Jack deuce deuce. The small blind, who's only about $450 effective to start this hand, leads for 115. In retrospect, I should probably just be folding here, but with 2 overs and a backdoor diamond draw, I make the call. Every other player folds, and the turn comes the 10 of clubs. My opponent goes all in for about half pot, $221. As tempting as it is now with a gut shot, we are not getting the right price and end up folding. Next up, I have ace king off in the cutoff. There is an early position limp for $10, and I raise to $50. The small blind, the same guy that cold called our 3-bet earlier with pocket nines, a very loose and aggressive opponent, 3-bets to $200. I've seen this player do this with a number of different hands. For this reason, I feel pretty happy about just jamming here and getting them to fold or call with worse. So this is what we do. I 4-bet all in for about $1,400 effective. Being that there is a $10 straddle on, this makes it not such a huge jam. I mean, it's only about 140 bigs. My opponent makes a call, and the flop comes 9-8-7. The turn is a 7, and the river is a 6. Things are not looking good for us, especially when my opponent shows pocket 8s. For a boat, if we are being results oriented, we just lost a flip, but maybe I don't have to jam pre-flop. I could attempt to 4-bet and deuce, or even just call. Maybe all in is actually the worst option. Not sure. In the next hand, I am up against the same opponent as last hand, who ends up limping under the gun for $10. The button straddle is on in this hand for $10, and we raise in the small blind to $80. This is a larger size than I would normally use, but that's for good reason. The under the gun player makes the call, and we go heads up to a flop that comes ace-5 deuce. Being out of position versus a very aggressive opponent, I start off by checking, and my opponent bets $100. With just 1 over to my pair, I can't fold quite yet. I make the call. The turn comes the 7 of spades. I check, and my opponent checks back this time. The river is a 6 of spades. I check once again, and my opponent bets $300 into about 360. This one could honestly go either way against this specific opponent. I think the bet check bet line is pretty strong in general, so I do end up folding here. In the next hand, I have pocket 10s in the big blind. There is an under the gun 1 raise to $30, under the gun 2, and the button call. I squeeze to $180. Like I said, this is a loose game. The under the gun and under the gun 1 player both make the call. The flop comes ace-9-9. This is once again not a great flop for me versus the same opponent from the past 2 hands. I check, and this opponent bets $200. The other opponent folds in this hand, and I make the call. The turn comes the 4 of clubs. I check again, and this time my opponent bets $425 5 into about 1,000. Although I have a hard time believing anything this specific opponent does, I end up making the fold. In the next hand, I have king queen of diamonds and raise under the gun 1 to $30. The cutoff calls and the small blind goes all in for $170. To my surprise, the under the gun straddle calls. This player is only about $600 effective. So if we are playing in terms of big blinds, which I think we should be, the $600 stack is very small. For this reason, I just ship it all in. The cutoff folds and the under the gun player thinks about it for a while, but eventually calls. I'm certainly happy to not see a snap call, and the flop comes 10, 8, 3, 2 diamonds. The turn is the deuce of diamonds, and the river is the ace of spades. We have a flush, and can only assume we are best, so I turn my hand over, and we are. We pick up a nice $1,400 pot without doing too much work. In the next hand, I have ace king off and raise to $30 in the low jack. The hijack 3 bets to $90. And the big blind 4 bets to $225. This player is about $1,000 effective. Don't really want to 5 bet get it in here because if I get snap called, I'm basically dead. I also think folding is a bit weak when my opponent could certainly have pocket queens. So I decide to just call, and the original 3 better ends up folding. The flop is a mystery. All that matters is I don't hit an ace or a king. My opponent checks and I check back. The turn is also a mystery with about $540 in the pot. My opponent finally bets $300 and I fold. On to the final hand of the night. I have ace queen off and raise to $30 in the hijack. The cutoff 3 bets to $90. This is the same exact opponent that 3 bet us in the last hand and folded when there was a 4 bet. The small blind ends up cold calling the $90. The cutoff in this hand has been stacked a couple times, so is certainly tilting and has been very aggressive. For this reason, along with the dead money from the small blind, I 4-bet to $325. It doesn't take too long for the hijack to 5-bet to $800. The small blind now, of course, gets out of the way and action is back to us. We certainly do not want to call and play this hand post-flop. We are about $2,000 effective to start this hand. With ace-queen off, it's either fold or 6-bet bluff all in. And if you know anything about me, I don't give up. And if you know me, I trust my reads. I trust my gut. I won't be bitched around at the poker table. I 6-bet all in for about $2,000. And my opponent immediately folds. Let's go. We are very happy this bluff gets through to end the night and cash out. What is up, ladies and gents? We are leaving the win at 3 a.m. Longer session than I thought it was going to be, but for good reason. We bought in for $1,500, cashed out for $5,100, so quite the profit, and we're quite happy about it. I think it's like a $3,500 profit. The one hand I kind of regret is the ace-king jamming pre versus my friend's pocket eights. Probably didn't have to do that, but I did, and we lost the flip for like $1,500. And that 6-bet bluff at the end of the night, that was sick. If you guys enjoyed the video, hit the like button, subscribe. Thanks for watching. Peace.